Okay, we are live.
Okay. A warm welcome to all of our listeners and our viewers. My name is Farid Esack. I'm a professor at the Johannesburg Institute for Advanced Studies, which is connected to the University of Johannesburg. But far more important, I'm here in my capacity as a board member of Africa for Palestine. Africa for Palestine is a Johannesburg-based organization that works in solidarity with the Palestinian people for justice. And also our particular and increasing focus is stemming the influence that Israel is making into the larger continent of Africa. Today, Africa for Palestine has the immense privilege of having Gideon Levy with us. Gideon, well, if my readings have been correct about Gideon, Gideon's growing awareness of the injustices towards the Palestinians, both under different forms of occupation, really. In the Israel proper or Palestine, it's different forms of occupation, really, came to the fore, particularly coupled with his journey as a journalist for Haaretz. It's one of my favorite newspapers in the world. Not that Haaretz is without its warts, but so other than being a journalist for Haaretz, Gideon, often largely through his work in Haaretz, but also in his public travels, in his advocacy, in his work throughout the world, has emerged as one of those great, iconic, really heroic figures in the for the struggle for justice for Palestinians. Just before we went live, I spoke to Gideon about a certain kind of entity or element or personality that we had in the South African liberation struggle. And I mentioned the name of Btselem. Now, of course, different ones amongst us in different ways who were a part of the struggle paid the price. It wasn't just excitement. But if there was one community that paid a very, very deep price, or individuals, then it was actually the Afrikaners who identified with the liberation struggle, the Antjie Cross, the Brown Fishers, the Beyers and Nodies, the Breitenbachs. And these are great names in our legacy. So Gideon, coming from a Jewish background, being a Jew, having served in the IDF, having been an advisor to Shimon Peres for a number of years, for that kind of person to break ranks with what we know in Afrikaans as die volk, the nation, the people, and especially if the people invest itself with some kind of super or supranatural or divine purpose or divine myths, as God has given us this or God placed us, it's very hard. And so I don't have a cap, Gideon, but if I had a cap, I would have taken my cap off for you. So thank you very much for joining us here today. Gideon, if I may start off with a question, and to those latecomers who just joined us, we are being joined by Gideon Levy, a writer for Haaretz and one of the most prominent voices in Israel for justice for the Palestinians. Gideon, tell us a little bit about your personal journey. How did you come to be this, for some of us, celebrated, and for some of this reviled figure?
First of all, let me thank you, Farid. For me, any
appearance in South Africa, either physically or virtually as we do it now, has a very, very, very special meaning, a very deep meaning. I mean, you mentioned my modest role, but I never paid the price that you did, all of you who struggled for freedom. And part of my way toward the Palestinians has to do also with some visits in your country, which enriched me and inspired me like no other place in the world. I'll get into it. So you were kind enough to ask me about myself, and I can just tell you that I started like a very good boy, Tel Aviv boy, Israel boy, Jewish boy, Zionistic boy, like all of us in this generation. And we were taught all kinds of things, among them many lies, like a people without a land came to a land without a people, like everything the Jews are doing is right and everything the Arabs are doing is wrong, like all the Arabs wants to throw us to the ocean, like the Arabs were born to kill us, like the fact that the Holocaust enabled us Israelis to do whatever we want because we are the victims, and as victims we have the right to do anything. So this was the framework in which I grew up. And then came, as you mentioned, the service in the army as a journalist and working with Shimon Peres, which was still on the dark side of the moon. And then I started to travel to the occupied territories, which most of the Israelis don't do, even though it's half an hour away from our homes. People don't know it, how close it is and how far it is. Our backyard, the dark backyard of Israel. And while traveling to the occupied territories, gradually but consistently, I came to many, many conclusions about who are we Israelis, what are we doing there, what is our moral profile, and getting obviously to know also the Palestinian people, its courage, its tolerance, and above all, its rights, which were never respected. And this was an ongoing journey until today. It is at least once a week, over 30 years now, at least once a week I go to the occupied territories to document crimes of the occupation. But it was a process. It was not like one day I saw the light or the darkness. It was a process in which I became more and more radical the more I saw and the more I understood and the more I realized. And it was also a very painful process of separating from Zionism, because you can't continue to believe in Zionism and think about yourself as a liberal or as or someone who cares about humanities, because by the end of the day, I'm very afraid to say Zionism is racist. That's, just in a small, as a small introduction. I guess we'll get to all those issues later on. And maybe I will mention just one thing, and those are the trips to South Africa, to your country, which really changed my views. Especially one tour, I've been a few times, once in a UN conference, once obviously in the funeral of Nelson Mandela, as I told you before, and one visit as a guest of your foreign ministry. And this was really, for me, this visit, meet many of your activists, big names, and I came back and something changed in me. I realized after this visit in South Africa that the unthinkable should be thought, that things that you think are impossible can become possible. That South Africa, with all its problems, and you know about them much more than I do, is today much more of a just place than 30 years ago. There's no argument about this. And above all, I came to the conclusion that the only solution is the one-state solution, one democracy between the Jordan River and the ocean, where like blacks and whites and colored, Jews and Palestinians will live together. This one state exists already today. The only problem is its regime. And its regime is an apartheid, and we'll get to it later. But in your country, there was a shift in my view when I realized, yes, it is possible. Even though everyone tells us it's not possible, it is possible.
Gideon, in South Africa, I mean, I've been to Israel about 8 or 9 times. And the kind of divides that one sees both in, say, lesser in a city like Tel Aviv, a bit more in Jerusalem, but even at its worst in Hebron. Those are very much the kinds of divisions that you saw in South Africa. Some permeability, a pretense of these things, and then black people, you could in fact pass your whole life through without encountering the black person as a person. You could encounter him as a worker on the street, but never as a person. And of course, all those anxieties about the communists, you know, and the blacks are inherently, so we had all of them. And so, yes, it is true that that in South Africa, yes, you know, we haven't, of course, been able to overcome all of our differences. But by and large, I mean, racism in South Africa it's a no-no. It could cause you to lose your job. It's something that is hidden deep inside the house or the closet, you know, where it actually belongs. So it is good, you know, that that South Africa has inspired others. I want to ask you about something that in some quarters is relatively still debated. And not so much, excuse me, not so much the reality of a single state, but the solidarity movements as a whole. We often take, as a solidarity movement, of course, we have to take our line from what do the Palestinians want from us, okay? And so some of our movements, we never pronounce on the one state or two state solution, and we seek refuge in the whole these things that the Palestinians and the Israelis must sort it out for themselves. It's not for us to prescribe to them what the solutions would be. And this is generally the public stance that is taken. If you scratch a bit below our skins and you ask us, you know, when the cameras are switched off, we will tell you what we think. Although with some humility, because we are not the Palestinians, and neither are we the Israelis to tell people what they must. But of course, it is, I think, remarkable that the world saw South Africa, in South Africa, the world saw apartheid as the problem. And in relation to Israel, they seem to think of apartheid as the solution. So could you tell us more about this activist kind of, we don't want to speak to how you must resolve things, but in the meanwhile, all of us have an awareness that this whole two-state thing is a complete dead duck?
Look, for many years, I believed in the two-state solution. I thought it is the most reasonable solution. People share one piece of land. Let's share the land and have two states. The Palestinians deserve self-definition and self-determination. The Jews deserve self-determination. Nothing is more simple than this. But after 53 years of Israeli occupation, some lies, some bluffs must be called, some lies must be torn. And the first lie is that the occupation is temporary. For many years, most of the world believed, and most of the Israelis obviously, The occupation is temporary. It's just, around the corner waits the solution. Around the corner, Israel is waiting for the Palestinian partner. And one day, this will come to its end, the occupation will come to its end. After 53 years, you have to realize that Israel had the intention to put an end to the occupation and will never have the intention to do it. It will never happen that one shining morning, the Israelis will wake up and say, oh, Farid, the occupation is not so nice, let's put an end to it. It will not happen. Like I believe the whites would have never given up apartheid system just because they would realize there is something immorality or unjust in it. Same in Israel. The second lie that must be exposed is the fact that the situation is still reversible. Namely, that a Palestinian state is a possibility, a viable one, and we are talking only about a viable Palestinian state. Where? You have been to Israel so many times and to Palestine, and you know the map, and you saw it on the ground. 700,000 settlers, including the Jews in East Jerusalem, will never be removed. The settlers are the strongest power group in Israeli society. Nobody, no Israeli statesman will be able to evacuate 700,000 settlers. And without their evacuation, there is no viable Palestinian state. So to continue to dream about something which is just impossible practically is playing into the hands of the occupation. The EU, the United States, most of the world is talking about two-state solution while knowing that is already impossible. But like this, including, by the way, the PA, the Palestinian Authority, they also stick to this train that left already the station, unfortunately. We have to realize it. The settlers won. And if we realize it, and most of the people say, yes, you're right, but maybe there is some last chance for a two-state solution. But nothing is working for this. The occupation today is stronger than ever. The Palestinians today are weaker than ever. The world has less interest than ever to solve this problem. And in this reality, to start to continue to speak, to sing yesterday's songs, which are irrelevant anymore, is really playing to the hand of the occupier. And therefore, after a visit in your country, at least for me, it was very clear that we have to reset everything. Namely, start to talk about one person, one voice as a guideline. Because when we go to this struggle, it will be much harder for Israel to say no. Why no? Because of security? Why no? Because the Jews are the chosen people? Why no? Because Jews have more rights in this place than others? It will put Israel in the corner, and Israel will have one day to answer the question, are you ready to give equal rights? Yes or no? If Israel will say yes, which it will never do, then everything is fine, obviously. The Palestinians will go for it, I can assure you. If it will be a real equality, tomorrow morning. But Israel will say no. And then the world will know that Israel is an apartheid state. And then the world will have to answer, to challenge this question. Are you ready for a second apartheid state in the world? Will you continue to treat Israel as the darling of the West, supporting and supplying and arming like before? Are you ready to use the same means that you used so successfully with South Africa? Are you ready to use them also vis-a-vis Israel? And if not, why not? Why is it different? So that's the vision. Inspired a lot by your country.
Yeah, but Gideon, I mean, you have this phenomenon that is commonly called in a clichéic way in the United States, PEP, progressive acceptance for Palestine. And it's something that I often struggle to grapple with, you know. I mean, the most decent of some of my Jewish friends or associates, or, well, not in South Africa that many, but when I was teaching in the States, and they get every single cause right. They are on the good side of every single cause, from climate change to Black Lives Matter to the rights for illegal domestic workers working in the States and so on. And at the same time, there is this fascinating blind spot when it comes to Israel and the assimilation or the conflation of Jewish identity with the political identity of a contemporary nation state. What makes this so hard for people when this question comes up?
If I may, Farid, it's a very good question and a very basic question, because here lies the key for everything. As long as the world will continue to see Israel as something else, as something special, as long as Israel has immunity, as long as Israel is not taking any responsibility and is not punished by any way for its crimes, nothing will move. And therefore, by the way, communities like yours and organizations like yours are right now the only hope, both of Palestinians and Jews who would like to see justice. It's a combination of factors, part of them manipulated by Israel, I must say. Above all, it is the special story of the Jewish people, which touches both Christians, many Christians, especially in the United States, as you know, and others, even people of conscience, who are aware both of the history of the Jewish people and obviously the Holocaust. The Holocaust paralyzes Europe because of guilt feelings. And Europe, mainly Western Europe, and also Eastern Europe, is paralyzed and is incapable of criticizing Israel because immediately it is accused as anti-Semitic. And Israel is manipulating it, especially in last years, where any criticism about Israel is immediately labeled as anti-Semitism. And people in Europe and also in the United States don't dare to raise their voice because they're scared to be accused as anti-Semites. Nobody wants to be labeled as anti-Semite. Israel is also playing on all kinds of sentiments, which part of them are authentic, like guilt feelings. I mean, I don't think that Europe shouldn't have guilt feelings toward the Jewish people. But Europe takes also responsibility for the destiny of the Palestinian people, because we know very well indirect responsibility, including the Germans, obviously, because we know very well that without the Shoah, without the Holocaust, there is a big doubt if the state of Israel and Zionism would have become into reality. I doubt it very much. My parents came in 1939 to Palestine because of Hitler, not because of any other reason. They would have continued their life in Czech Republic and Germany, and they would never come to this part of the world. It's Hitler who made them come to Israel and become Zionists, yeah? So this paralyzes a part of public opinions. The other thing is, and this is also a similarity with your country, that Israel has located itself as a front outpost of the West in this jungle of barbaric, Islamistic environment. Like you, South Africans, were the outposts against the blacks and the communists, the Western outpost of the West. Israel is perceived as the Western outpost of the West also today. and there are many interests who play here. Israel is also very powerful, as you know, both militarily but also diplomatically. Israel has open doors in Washington like very few other countries. And all this gives Israel a very, very special position in the international community.
Okay, so Gideon, the question then arises, okay, I mean, the first, when you spoke about the conscience of Europe, I don't know, but it does seem to be a very selective conscience. When, for example, the Belgians are confronted with the atrocities of millions of people in the Congo, then this conscience is dead. When the Germans are confronted with the massacre of a huge percentage, nearly 20% of the Herero people in Namibia, then this conscience is dead. So, I mean, let me be honest with you, and of course, nothing, can excuse the Holocaust, and I don't want to engage in games of cheap, calculations of my deaths are more than your deaths. But I suspect, Gideon, that there is a strong element of racism also involved in this. That we killed our own people, and whatever Jews may be, I mean, in the international imagination, in the European imagination, there are, of course, minority Jews who are, say, from the Ashkenazi Jews from, or the Mizrahi Jews from North Africa, or Ethiopia, or, okay. But for Europe, I mean, it's often, I think, it's a white question also. And so many Zionists, in fact, are knowingly moving on a wave of white supremacy. Because white suffering is more important than black suffering and more consequential. And so I don't know if it is really a question of conscience, genuine remorse for what we did to the Jews. And of course, the gypsies and gay people and physically differently abled people. What do you say to that, Gideon?
I couldn't agree more, Farid. It's part of the problem, but let's face it. When at 9/11, hundreds of Americans are killed, it shakes the world. When millions of Africans, Black Africans, are being slaughtered in all kinds of wars, the world couldn't give a damn. Excuse me for my language. That's part of the problem, obviously. I'll tell you more than this. Even today, let's leave the Holocaust. If one settler is killed, it makes a story in Western international media, for sure in the United States, for sure in the New York Times. At the same time, it can be tens of Palestinians killed and you will hardly hear about it. Life is not equal, and Jewish life is perceived both in Israel and in the West as worth more than Palestinian lives or African lives.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So, Gideon, for you as an Israeli, and I don't know, but I kind of sense, I haven't been to Israel in a good few years now, since they have officially imposed a ban on activists from the BDS movement coming. But I kind of just see the society moving further and further to the right. If you look at the decimation of Labour Party, you see, the state of Meretz, for example. And in the midst of all of this, Gideon, what keeps you going and motivated? Why do you, I mean, okay, all of us, we agree on how powerful Israel is, how powerful the Zionist lobby is. And in the middle of this, we keep on keeping on. What moves you? Why do you keep on going on?
I'll be very honest with you, Farid. I have no other choice. That's the truth. What choice do I have? I cannot live with it. I have no intention to leave Israel because that's my place. I was born here and I will die here. That's my culture, my language, everything. And what other choice do I have except of raising my voice? Because, you know, when you face such an injustice, when you face so many atrocities and crimes on a daily basis, you know, the crimes in the occupied territories are on the daily basis. The minute that we are talking now, there are some crimes committed half an hour away from my home on a daily basis. You can't keep still, you know, if you struggle, you can't turn your eyes away because you know all this. Unlikely most of the Israelis who deny it and live in denial, I go there and I see it and I have my friends there and I cannot close my eyes anymore. Too late. I was there when I was a young Israeli, as I told you before. Then I kept closed eyes and I lived in peace with myself. Today, I have no other choice but to continue.
That's a remarkable response, Gideon. I have a kind of a, you may have gathered, I have a kind of a, I often approach things in a bit of a religious way also, you know. And I often say, I mean, whether one believes in a last day or not, that's not. But to imagine that, you know, just facing yourself into the mirror, how can I live with myself if I don't speak? So it's just a question of living with oneself, that I saw this happening and I did not remain silent. So, I mean, yeah, in some ways, absolutely. I mean, okay. I want to move on to something more concrete, and that is the Btselem report that recently came out titled A Regime of Supremacy from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea. This is apartheid. I'm sure you've looked at it. Could you tell us a bit more about this report, Gideon? And what kind of impact it may have? I mean, it has received a lot of publicity abroad in, say, the New York Times, the Washington Post. And again, sadly, it doesn't matter who else picks it up or doesn't pick it up. If it gets picked up in Washington and in New York, then it was really picked up. So it has received a lot of publicity recently. Can you tell us a bit about the report itself? And if you think that Israeli society will pause and reflect on this report, especially the very clear description by an Israeli organization of Israel as an apartheid society.
It was picked up almost everywhere in the world except of one place, Israel. The Israeli, I can't say that Israel ignored it, but the Israeli media as a whole, which is the biggest collaborator with the occupation, really tried to ignore it. I mean, they published it, but as small as possible. And the systematic way of not bothering the Israelis too much with those things. Now, Btselem is the biggest Israeli human rights organization. Very professional, very reliable, and works for many, many years and has quite a lot of reputation abroad and also in Israel. For many years, they dedicated their work only to the crimes in the occupied territories. What made the big difference in this report is the fact that it's the first time that they say what they think, they declare what they think about Israel as a whole. Because like me, they came to the conclusion, which should have been a long time ago, that you can't separate anymore. That this separation between the occupied territories and Israel, again, plays to the hands of the occupier. Because then you have this lovely democracy called Israel, this villa in the jungle, as one of the Israeli prime ministers defined it. And then in the backyard, there is some brutal regime, but very temporary and far away. It's a different place. And then we can live with it somehow, because Israel itself is such a lovely democracy and liberal democracy. Btselem came to the conclusion that we can't continue with this lie because there is no possibility to make the separation anymore. Because the fate of a peasant next to Jenin is being decided in Jerusalem by the Israeli Jewish government. And they all live under one regime. And you can't be half a democracy, like you can't be half pregnant. And once Israel is maintaining this brutal regime in the occupied territories, Israel cannot be defined anymore as a democracy. Because you can't be a democracy and say, oh, but I have this backyard where all those atrocities are taking place. No, it doesn't work like this. If there are atrocities who are taking place, so the whole regime is not a democracy. Btselem came to this conclusion that we can't separate anymore, that the green line is dead, and there is one state in which, yes, Jews are living in a democracy, but that's exactly that the Jews are privileged over the Palestinians. And this can be defined only as an apartheid system.
I mean, I was very conscious during the years of the struggle against apartheid that we were accused of many, many things, we in the liberation struggle. And of course, I mean, our liberation struggle wasn't really hunky-dory. It wasn't as if we were a perfect species of people. It's not, I mean, we weren't confronted with the question about where is your Mandela, the way many Palestinians are confronted, give us a Mandela. The whites weren't aware of, the ordinary whites weren't aware. If they were aware, they didn't care a hoot about Mandela, who was languishing on Robben Island. But there is this continuous need that oppressed and occupied communities have to in some ways, you know, display their humanness and their humanity, which often for the oppressor just means indicate your willingness to be walked over. Lie down so that we can ride over you, and this is what will make you acceptable to us. But I do want to raise possibly the awkward question in some contexts. The concern, I mean, about the religionization, and this is also increasing, the religionization of responses in the area. And I don't want to say the conflict, because often when we speak about the conflict, it's like, you know, as if there's a slight argument between two people. No, it is occupation. No, it is oppression. No, it is dispossession. So don't just talk about the conflict. It's not a conflict. There's a war being waged on the people, okay? But having said that, is there any legitimacy? And as I'm asking the question, Gideon, I feel rather foolish. I feel like somebody interviewing somebody in the apartheid era and saying, you know, is there any legitimacy to the question that the communists are waiting behind the bush, ready to take over? And of course, there were communists, and there are still communists in South Africa, and they're happily a part of the government. And there are, I mean, Ronnie Kasrils, for example, is one of the leading communists in South Africa. Joe Slovo, the father of our liberation army, was also, like Kasrils, a Jew, and they were communists. So, okay, so they were communists, okay. But I want to raise it in your context. The kind of anxieties, not so much about, as they regrettably discovering late in America now, not right-wing white nationalism, so not Jewish right-wing, well, if there is such an animal in, because the vast majority of Israelis seem to be going into that direction, but I'm talking about, say, you know, some of the real things. Okay, so that is a problem. We're ignoring it at the moment. But the big problem is really the rise of Islamism. And Islamic fundamentalism is something that we have to watch out for. Is this a problem in a possible progressive Israeli discourse? And if so, how do they deal with it?
It's a problem, but it is also an excuse not to do anything. There is nothing that happened to Israel better than the uprising of Hamas. You know, as long as there were moderate secular Palestinians like Yasser Arafat and others, it was a challenge for Israel. When Hamas comes, it's much easier, or Hezbollah, or Iran, it's much easier for Israel to market it to the Western world and say, you don't mean that we will sit with those Islamists, with those fundamentalist Islamists. The world understands it, especially after 9/11 and all the other things that happened in the West, and facing those problems in many European countries and in the United States. So it played into Israelis' hands in many ways. But Farid, above all, you must understand that what happened to Israeli society, the real worst thing that happened to Israeli society, is not its movement toward the right, and it did move toward the right. The real problem is that the Palestinian issue is off the table, that nobody deals with it anymore, that nobody is concerned about it and nobody cares about it. That the most significant phenomena which defines the moral profile of Israel is not even being discussed anymore. I remember once the joke was that two Israelis share three views. Today, three Israelis hardly share one view when it comes to the Palestinian problem. They just, with the help, with the assistance of the media and other agents, they just got to a situation of total denial and lack of any kind of interest. It's even not being right-wing, it's even not being racist. It's just say, if we don't speak about the elephant, if we don't look at the elephant which is in the room, the elephant will disappear somehow. That's the major sentiment today in the Israeli discourse. And this is much worse than becoming right-wing, because then you can fight it somehow. Once it's off the table, once nobody cares, nobody wants to hear about it, nobody wants to discuss about it, nobody is ready to do anything about it, then we are really in a problem. And then it is only about the international community to remind Israel that the elephant is still in the room, and how.
You know, Gideon, in South Africa, the Zionist community, of which I think the vast majority of South Africans, as you probably, of South African Jews are, of course, Zionists, although we have a not inconsequential number of, well, we have at least two groups and many individuals inside the Jewish community who are deeply opposed to Israeli apartheid. But they often latch onto the last part of Mandela's life, when Mandela emerged as a free person from prison, and you will recall that he refused to be released. Mandela could have been released from prison at least 10 years before that. But he refused to, in this particular case, renounce the armed struggle, limited as it may have been. He refused to because a prisoner can't negotiate. Okay. So, so what happens in South Africa is Mandela, the peacemaker, Mandela, the mediator, it's the only Mandela that they recognize. As if they only saw this man as, you know, Father Christmas, giving out some chocolates and sweets to well-behaving children. And so the whites behaved well. And then he came with on his reindeer and he gave all these whites some nice chocolates or sweets or something. So this is the way South African, on the whole, the South African Jewish community, all the Zionists certainly inside this community, respond to Mandela. And they use this as an argument. Mandela, and so in some ways, it also plays into the South African national ego. You know, we are the people who can play a role in reconciliation. But that, of course, as anybody knows, it's one part of our history. The larger part of our history was, and Mandela didn't go to sit on Robben Island, the prison, because he was busy baking cakes for the Sunday school, you know, or for the shul or whatever. So what do you make about this? And more specifically, you know, what should be South Africa's role, if it has any, in fact, in addressing the question of the dispossession of the Palestinians?
So those are two questions. But first, I must tell you that what you describe about the Jewish community in South Africa is very similar to what happened here in Israel. Many liberal Israelis say, oh, if we only would have had a Palestinian Mandela or a Palestinian Mahatma Gandhi, then everything would have been solved. And when they mention Mandela, exactly, they think that Mandela was this nice guy who spoke in this wonderful terminology about equality and peace and never had a real struggle and never had no other problem but to have this struggle. So they ignore it and they, you know, put some makeup on Mandela. And this excuse also to say, oh, if they will only have a Mandela, we will make peace. That's obviously nonsense because Israel has no intention to go for peace. And it could be 10 Mandelas on the Palestinian side and Israel will say no, and 10 Mahatma Gandhis and Israel will say no, until Israel will not have any other choice but to go for it, or until the price that Israel will pay will be much too high to continue it. Because most of the Israelis, you know, Farid, don't care so much about the occupation. But why would they bother to put an end to it? Why? Who needs all this headache? So, you know, let us continue. As long as Israel has nothing to lose from continuing the occupation, and that's the situation now, nothing will change. Now comes the question, what can South Africa, what role can it play? First of all, in the international context of today, in which the world lost interest, in which the world is supporting Israel maybe like never before, with all those populist regimes in Brazil, in Philippines, and obviously Donald Trump and others, in East Europe, in Hungary, in Poland, in Romania, all this international atmosphere does not give much hope for the Palestinians, because all those elements have no interest in their fate or in their rights. The only hope is of civil societies. The only hope is from societies in many countries, mainly in democracies, when it also matters, when the civil societies raise their voice, there is someone who listens to them. South Africa is a very special case because South Africa, I don't have to tell you, has also a symbolic significance. And, Israel is trying to, again, as we live in denial, we also live in denial with the fact that, for example, South Africa is one of the very few countries in the world today who does not have an ambassador in Israel. It was quite hidden. I passed many times at the residence, a beautiful residence of the South African ambassador here, and it's locked. And very few Israelis know it. I think if more Israelis would have known it and would have known the reason, it would make us, hey, why, South Africa, we supply them with nuclear, we supply them with everything. Where are they? It's about a long journey of raising voice, of struggling. I think also the Palestinians deserve any kind of sympathy and solidarity because they are right now lonely as never before. I think they are in the worst position ever since 1948. The Arab world turned their back to them, as you know, most of the Arab world, if not all of it. Europe lost interest. And I think that they deserve also some kind of solidarity, especially for places like from countries and societies like the South Africans. So there's a role to play. To tell you that this will be a game changer, unfortunately not for the short run.
Gideon Levy, thank you very much for joining us in conversation today. Your clear-headedness, the ruthlessness of your truths, your refusal to be glibly positive, your realism. All of this together is an enormous source of inspiration for us. As you were talking, I thought, gosh, now, of course, as Africa for Palestine, we engage in this kind of thing. But as you're thinking, oh gosh, I really must make sure that all our members, that all our board members listen to this. So as bleak as what you sometimes appeared, your realism spurs us on, to a deeper level of commitment. As Mandela, said famously, that our struggle will never be over until the Palestinians are not free. Of course, as internationalists, we understand that there are also other struggles and we're also busy with different other things all the time. But as South Africans, we have a particular insight into some of the challenges that your society faces. So Gideon, thank you very, very much for joining us, and stay safe and have a good the rest of your day. Okay.
Thank you so much, Farid, for having me. It was for me really a special experience. I hope we'll meet face to face one day, and keep up your struggle. Really, you and your organization, we need you there.
Thanks, my brother and comrade. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.
And bye to our